What's up, YouTube? Hope everybody is doing okay. So this video will probably be getting posted after the Legacy Content Creator Showdown. But as I've been gearing up for that event, I was kind of playing through a lot of Demir Tempo and Legacy, and I kind of had this thought of like, what would happen if I just ported over the Legacy variation as close as I could into Modern and just see what happens. Because like the Legacy variation, really good about leveraging like Force of Will with Psychic Frog uh, and Tameo. Obviously, you get Brainstorm. It's not the same deck by any stretch of the imagination, but I just wanted to take kind of the template over and see what it looked like. So in Legacy, you get Ponder, you get Brainstorm. In Modern, you get Preordain and Consider. Very, very different power levels, but 8 1-mana cantrips. You don't get Daze, but we get Spell Pierce and Spell Snare, kind of some cheap interactive counters. We get Tameo in both formats, which is cool. 4 Fatal Push, couple Thoughtseize across both lists. We don't get Force of Will, but we do get Force of Negation. If you squint hard enough, like Legacy runs Force Negation in the sideboard, so it's got to be playable, right? Uh, we get Force Negation and then Counterspell to kind of help fill in a little bit of the gaps. We get Orcish Bowmaster just the same, Psychic Frog the same, Shoot the Sheriff, Murktide, Regent. A lot of the cards do overlap. Obviously, there is a very big difference between things like Brainstorm and Consider or Daze and Counterspell. But when you just have like a working theory, the best thing I think you can do is throw it together, give it a shot, see what it looks like, and then go from there to make some room for some of the changes and move the Harbinger of the Seas to the sideboard, which also fits the Legacy build. Stern Scolding, Mystical Dispute, Consign to Memory, and a full 4 of 2 Toxic Deluge, a Graveyard Trespasser, an additional Thoughtseize in the board for some of these combo decks, and a couple Nihil Spellbomb. The idea here is we've been a Frog Force Negation deck already. This is just taking that to the extreme, like giving you Frog and Tameo that you can hopefully force to protect and win a game off that. The downside is obviously we're not as mana advantaged as the Legacy builds with Force of Will and Daze being just free counter spells. It's a whole world of difference. In addition, not being able to auto flip Tameo with a Brainstorm is unfortunate, but you got to start somewhere. You still have Psychic Frog, Preordain, Consider to hopefully get that job done. Some of the key differences I've noticed between Legacy and Modern is Legacy is a lot less removal heavy and a lot less aggressive creature heavy. So things like Force of Negation are more polarized, where Force of Will covers whatever you need to counter. Force of Negation is really good against like the removal spells or the non-removal decks. Not against the creature decks, like absolutely horrible against the creature decks where Force of Will you can still hit your opponents like turn 1 Heritage Druid or turn 1 Ragavan or whatever. So you got to keep that in mind. Other than that, excited to try it out. I always love decks that are very mana efficient, play efficient, trying to leverage that tempo advantage. So hopefully Force Negation in a full 4 can kind of show off a little bit. So let's go ahead and show off some of the gameplay. This is a voiceover league. As always, if you enjoy this kind of content, let me know in the comments down below. Also links below to the deck list, the Discord, Twitch, all that fun stuff. And I have started posting the deck guides to traditional and the Oculus builds. So if you're interested in learning more about those decks, we'll have the guides down below. Quick mold of 5. Let's Rewind a couple seconds. I've got my notes, but this is why you pay attention to your notes and don't just watch the screen and ramble. But I do usually keep like a general guideline of ideas on here as to things that I need to pay attention to mentioning over the course of the video. So like this one, opening 7, no lands, 6, 1 land, counterspell, 4 2-drops, and 2 1-drops that I can't cast, so ship it. 5's not bad. We do have Preordain, we have Thoughtseize, we have some lands, some spells, so I think we'll ship back the counterspell because we can't actually cast it, and one of the forces because I can't really afford to force everything. The Leyline of the Guild Pact. I want to go ahead and get this Preordain down because I don't really care about the 1-drops, but I want to be able to Thoughtseize on 2 to take Scion of Draco. And fortunately, nothing else like really matters outside of Scion. So picking up the 3rd land, really nice. Decide to hold up the frog because I'm pretty sure from that Thoughtseize I saw a Leyline binding, so I don't want to just throw the frog to its doom. Afford to take a couple hits and try to find like another card to force the issue a little bit. Keep the Murktide so that I can play out the frog and hold up the Murktide once they answer the frog. Fortunately, just losing too much life to be able to stabilize here. We could have forced a negation the Leyline binding on the frog, but I'm just staring down like a Nicodle that's swinging through. I'd be out of cards. Frog's going to have a very difficult time attacking, so it's not the threat that I want to protect. If I had known that they were going to wait until their turn to play the Leyline binding, then obviously I would have played out the Murktide instead of the frog and forced the Leyline. But since they had the mana available on my turn to instep the Leyline, didn't seem like quite the plan I wanted to roll with. So we get some late Tamiyo action. Is not really the time you want to see Tamiyo. Bowman down to 4, and then they have a dashed Ragavan here, so that is exactly lethal regardless of how I block. Ship it up, move to game number 2. I will say, let's pause real quick. This legacy-heavy interpretation does feel like it is taking that game 1 polarization to the extreme. Like you're going to be a lot better against the non-creature decks, a lot worse against the creature decks. So you really have to be not overly confident, but not get distraught if you lose game 1, because it's going to happen a lot. So you got to be geared to shift to like game 2, game 3 mode, come back with a game plan and really focus on that in the post-board games. Like against Zoo here, my entire post-board game plan is pretty much don't let Scion of Draco resolve. Period. Scion of Draco, I think, is like the only card that you aggressively care about. I mean, sometimes you'll have like Flage Arena and you got to counterspell that, obviously, but Scion with a Leyline is one of the few ways that they can just cheese you out of an easy win. So Consigned to Memories coming in, bringing in a copy of Toxic Deluge because it's the only way to answer a Scion with a Leyline unless you have like Sink into Stupor and Shoot the Sheriff. But they're both one-ofs, so not really banking on that happening. boarding out some of the bowmasters because they just get run over really easy. Board out a Thoughtseize, some forces. What else did I bring in? Brought in Graveyard Trespasser, a little extra help against Flage, plus like the ward on it's really nice into things like Leyline Binding. Harbinger of the Seas came in. About the gist of it. As always, like I said, I got the matchup guide below, so if you're wanting a more specific breakdown of sideboarding, you can go there. I know I've got Zoo on it, so turn one, we'll just fling out Tamiyo, get our card advantage going. Opponent's got a Ragavan, so we've got an answer to that rolled up. And since they're on this basic mountain, we know they can't have a Scion of Draco here on turn 2. Some clues rolling. Decide to preordain over Thoughtseize. So we'll talk about this one a little bit. My opponent didn't cast a lightning bolt like on their turn when I have this Tamiyo. So I'm assuming they don't have a lightning bolt if they're not casting it. They just like passed through after I killed the Ragavan. They didn't play a backup Ragavan or anything. So I'm assuming their hand is a bunch of like 2-drops, maybe Leyline Binding, whatever. But I've got an answer to Scion of Draco in my hand now with the Shoot the Sheriff. And I can lead on Thoughtseize in case I'm worried about something like Stubborn Denial. So I've got a lot of game against the Scion, so I decided to just like go ahead and aggressively flip the Tamiyo, get that going. And if they do follow up with a Scion, that's fine. If they follow up with like a dashed Ragavan and use a bunch of their mana, that's fine. If they follow up with like a Territorial Kavu, again, I've got the Shoot the Sheriff. But I think Tamiyo like flipping and working towards the ultimate here is a really big deal. Flage is cool. So we get to Flage. I'm really bad about like not stopping on Thoughtseizes in non-shadow decks. So there we go. So they've got another Flage. They've got Leyline of the Guild Pack, Scion of Draco, Territorial Kavu. They've got basic plains and basic mountains. So I decided to take the Flage, get down the Harbinger so that they can't Scion, they can't Leyline, they can't Kavu. They've got to like find something off the top. And if they don't find something off the top right here, then I just get to untap with like Preordain, Clue Token. Tamiyo could buy something back if I want, whatever the case may be. So naturally, they immediately top deck the Lightning Bolt. We find counter spells, so now I have an answer to the Flage, which is huge. They're not going to be able to escape a second Flage anytime soon. I've got Tamiyo continuing to tick up. So definitely lucky to top deck the counter spell, but I mean, if you're playing Modern, you're playing for some amount of luck. You expect everything to go smoothly, you're going to have a very sad time. All right. Keeping this hand based off Tamiyo plus Force and like a bunch of stuff I can ditch to Force. I've got some cantrips to help find a second land. Them having turn 1 Ragavan's a little annoying, but Tamiyo can stonewall it. I can force their first piece of interaction. So hopefully Tamiyo can just like slow things down a little bit. Turns out Tamiyo can slow things down a whole lot more than I had originally thought. So not only does she slow it down, she actually is going to stonewall this Ragavan because they only had 1 lightning bolt and no second land drop. So we'll take that. Now we're just going to sit on counter spell, like no reason to to force any cantrips when my opponent's not doing anything. We can cycle this Consider into turn. Like, I could have flipped Tamiyo a couple turns ago, but if I flip Tamiyo and tick up, then my opponent still gets to attack in for 1, even through the Tamiyo trigger, get a treasure token, and I do not want to give them free access to mana here. I could Deluge for 1 to get rid of the Ragavan, but that seems like not the most optimal use of my mana. But here we decide to flip the Tamiyo because I finally found a Fatal Push to interact with the Ragavan. So should be able to wrap things up pretty quickly from here. Pop a Soul Guide Lantern, still miss their land drop, so them's the beats. They do discard a Flage, but it's kind of a while before that Flage is going to matter. Here's a Frog, Tamiyo, double counterspell, GLHF. Minus Tamiyo, end up discarding like 9 cards here to make the Frog a 2-turn clock. And opponent ends up scooping like after the Frog hits. So I'll just skip over all that part, but basically just kept a bunch of counter spells and force and negations, consigns, and stuff in hand. This is match number 2 on the play. What was that first hand? Yeah, so 5 lands, Frog, FrogTide. Pretty easy shit back. Second one, couple counter spells, Fatal Push. Keep that, just throw back an extra land. Devourer, definitely not what we want to see on a hand with Fatal Push and no Frog. And so, like I said earlier, you're going to have a lot of these very polarizing games with this build. You really have to buy into the idea that game 1 just doesn't matter. You're going to have to force the issue a lot, like make it so that they have to have the whatever they're trying to have. Sowing Myco Spawn. Make it so that they have to have whatever the answer is. And if they do, cool. If they don't, cool. Either way, even if you lose, you got games 2 and 3. And I do think that's a really underestimated or undervalued skill in Magic in general, is people like lose game 1 and get distraught going into game 2, or win game 1 and think they can just cruise games 2 and 3. And like games 2 and 3 are a completely different animal than game 1. Game 1 is, I'd argue, like 75% luck and proactivity. In games 2 and 3, just like flip that on their head. Game 2 and 3 is 75% like preparation and planning. But since I decided that I'm jumping this Frog to get through the Myco spawn, I might as well ditch stuff like the FrogTide, get rid of some extra cards in hand, because I'm never going to play the FrogTide if I'm jumping the Frog. So just get rid of some extra stuff, try to get some extra damage for the Frog. This one was a weird little toss-up. So my opponent goes for Through the Breach. They might go spawned up a Boseiju, so the Through the Breach is uncounterable. So counterspell doesn't matter. I can sink into Stupor and put the Through the Breach back in hand, but then I just have to deal with the Through the Breach again next turn. It gives me a chance to find a Thoughtseize between my next draw step and the draw off the Frog, or maybe like cantrips to find a Thoughtseize, which is definitely a consideration. The alternative is if I let them resolve the Through the Breach and they don't put in an Emrakul the Aeon's Torn, I can sink into Stupor to bounce whatever they put in back to hand. Then the Through the Breach is dealt with. They probably can't hard cast the big Eldrazi that they put in. So I decided to take the risk, let them sink into Stupor, or let them resolve the Through the Breach to try to sink into Stupor what they put in. They put in Ulamog. Ulamog has got Ward, Sacrifice 2 permanents. I've got a bunch of extra lands, so pretty easy to sink into Stupor the Ulamog. Except I'm an idiot, and where it says over on the left-hand side down there, sacrifice 2 permanents, click a permanent to sacrifice it. For whatever reason, I thought that said okay, like sacrifice 2 permanents, okay. And you had to click okay to go to sacrifice your permanents or not. I absolutely went and just clicked no, thinking it was okay. Sync gets countered by the ward trigger, and yeah, I die. So the joy of Moto, like a loss like that wouldn't happen in paper. I would cast the Sink into Stupor. My opponent would say, pay the ward. I'd say, okay, sack these 2 lands. So as frustrating as it is, Moto losses happen from time to time. You kind of got to let those roll off your back. Going into game 2 against Through the Breach, Consigned to Memories coming in, Fatal Pushes coming out. That's like the big thing. Otherwise, Harbingers coming in, Spell Snares in this case coming out, and that's about it. Not really too much to talk about sideboarding. They got the Gemstone Caverns on the draw with the Devourer. So hopefully we can get some use out of like the Spell Pierce. I have liked having these considers in the list. Having access to an instant speed cantrip when you're holding up Spell Pierce and Consign is really, really nice. Go for the Myco spawn, so we'll go ahead and get our full Consign value here. I don't have, if I had a clock in hand, I might let the Myco spawn itself resolve in a situation like this, depending on the cantrips or depending on the interaction that I have. Like, probably not. If I had to consider, okay, let's pause. If I had to consider and a threat, I would probably let the Myco spawn body resolve and just consign the land search ability so that I could consider and then get down my threat. Because I don't actually care about the Myco spawn's 3/3 body. I care about it getting lands, and I care about it exiling by lands. So it is a little, pun intended, consideration there to not counter it. But since I don't have a consider in hand, just throwing everything at the Myco spawn, if that makes any sense. So we get to force a Kozilek's command, pack in with a frog. Should be, yeah, just play a FrogTide here. Hold up Spell Pierce. Maybe we get to counter like a 1-ring without a land drop. Unfortunately, they do have a land drop because they always have a land drop. Use up this Spell Pierce now, because if I don't use it on this, I'm not going to get to Spell Pierce a Through the Breach. Like, they're going to have too much mana, so I might as well just use the Spell Pierce. Bowmaster into a 1-ring. Ancient Stirrings. They found that second ring off the Ancient Stirrings, so, you know, Tron things. Want a FrogTide or another land, so we'll just sit on our Bowmaster. Really trying to find a consigned to memory. And they draw, and I think end up scooping to this. Yeah, so they must have just drawn completely dead, which is crazy to think that they saw like 6 cards and drew dead. But either way, we get to go to game 3 with a pretty good hand on the draw game 3. Get a consign, get a frog, get a harbinger, counter spell action. Holding up consign because this is where preparation comes into play. Like, I really want to interact with a turn 2 talisman on their side so that if I can get to this harbinger, they won't have available green mana, green or red mana. So holding up the consign here is more important than the preordain. Also, there's a small little chance they could have like Trinisphere or Chalice of the Void or something like that I want to interact with. But mostly it's wanting to hit a talisman. Not fetching. Again, another consideration here. Not fetching because I don't want my opponent to have the ability to respond with fetching or with a Kozilek's command for 1, because them creating scions is a way that they can get colorless mana around Harbinger of the Seas. So I don't want to just give them like a free window to resolve a Kozilek's command. Even though there's a reasonable chance they won't cast it on 1, it's still non-zero. It's something that I can't control. But here I fetch because I am actively trying to bait them to cast a Kozilek's command so that I could consign it here, untap, play a Harbinger. But opponent is too brainy for me. They did have the Kozilek's command, and I know I'm pausing like 17 times during this match. You just kind of have to deal with it. The reason for not jamming the Harbinger here is that Kozilek's command. Because if I cast the Harbinger and they respond with Kozilek's command for 2, they get to make the colorless mana so that they can go to their turn and maybe cast another Kozilek's command with the colorless mana and enough mana available to exile my Harbinger. I don't want that to happen. I want this Harbinger to hopefully kind of seal the deal. So we get a situation like this where our opponent jams on their turn. We get to consign the land search trigger. And now they don't have any lands. Or they don't have any land drops this turn. I could windmill slam the Harbinger. Unfortunately, I had to get the Watery Grave for the consign. So I don't have a black source for the Psychic Frog. I really can't afford to just jam a Psychic Frog here. Or I can't afford to jam a Harbinger here with no black source for the Frog, because I run the risk of just not being able to attack through Myco Spawn. And if I can't actually get the game over with, then eventually my opponent is going to draw copies of like the One Ring. But at the moment, I know they've got Double Devourer, Kozilek's command, and Unknown. So we counter this Kozilek's command, pass through, hopefully they whiff, and hopefully we can find a black source. Or a land that gets a black source to get down Harbinger. Bloom Lake doesn't really matter. Play Frog and Tameo. We know they've got, again, a Devourer. I just want to like get my board presence as filled up as I possibly can. Give myself the most draw chances to find a black source. But if I can't, like, I'm 100% slamming the Harbinger at this point, even if I don't find a black source. There's no reason to just keep waiting, especially now that I have like double Psychic Frog down. Opponent's attacking Myco spawn into my Tameo, which is cool. But all I really care about now is finding like consigns, finding counter spells. I could Tameo back the consign, but I mean, I will now. Yeah. I guess I couldn't last turn. I was too low on Tameo. So, yeah, we got consign. We're just going to discard everything and kill our opponent with some frogs. But cool match. I do think it's really important to take note in games like this of like delaying Harbinger when it seems like a windmill slam, identifying that our opponent's not doing anything relevant. We've got an opportunity to take a little extra time to put ourselves in a better spot when the Harbinger resolves. So we might as well do that, and recognizing early that, hey, not playing out the Harbinger plays around a couple things like double Kozilek's command. Turns out they had 3. So cool showcase there. So this is match 3, I believe. On the play, we've got Thoughtseize on turn 1 into what looks like energy. It looks like energy as they got a Guide of Souls, Amped Raptor, Goblin Bombardment, but take both a Preordain and a Frog. Spell Snare and Amped Raptors. Their hand is double Lightning Bolt, unknown. I took the Goblin Bombardment turn 1. I should have just played a Frog here. I know my opponent's got double Lightning Bolt, but I feel like I'm just not doing myself any favors if I don't just throw out the Frog at some point. At least I get the Lightning Bolts out of hand. But if I don't play out the Frog, I'm kind of playing perfectly into this where they just get to keep doing stuff. They find the Arena of Glory. They find the 4th land. They find the Flage. You know, typical Boros things. Now all I can do is play out the Merc, but I'm dead to double bolt to the face, plus Arena back a Flage. Literally nothing I could have done outside of let the Amped Raptor resolve. Like, that's not doing me any favors because I don't have a removal spell for that. All in all, the Boros matchup just sucks. I wish there was a better way to express it, but just everything about this matchup feels atrocious from start to finish. Sideboarding, taking out Tameo, taking out Thoughtseize, trimming on some forces. I'm not bringing in Harbinger in this matchup. I think that it's a better card against Mardu than against Boros. But for Boros especially, it's so easy to play around that I don't think it's worth bringing in. I think if you already have them in the main deck, you might trim, you might not cut all of them, but I just don't think it's impactful enough to board in for the matchup. But I will board in like Toxic Deluges, the Graveyard Trespasser. What else? Nihil Spell Bombs for Flage. And I'm sure there's something else that we'll see. Oh, Stern Scolding. So Ocelot Pride, we'll just go ahead and Bowmaster down the Pride. Get our basic swamp to play a little bit around Blood Moon. Like them having a double plane start kind of screams Blood Moon to me. Then get Trespasser down. If they have a Flage right here, like it's unfortunate-ish. But if they don't have the Flage, they don't have the way to get the Trespasser off the board. I would rather have it like on the board, ready to go. and figure things out from there, especially with the counter spell. Because once you get into like this 3, 4, 5 turn spot, if I don't play out the Graveyard Trespasser, when I do, I run the risk of like I can't play it out anytime over the next 3, 4 turns, because at any point they could just have a One Ring or have an Escape Flage, and I can't put myself in a position to not be able to answer that. Skyclave Apparition is going to eat a counter spell. We do at least have this frog where it can start attacking. Graveyard Glutton is a pretty nice little stop gap for some of their early aggression. They can attack with a cat token, but the cat token's probably not going to kill us. Probably not. It could. Whittle away their energy a little bit here and there. We're just trying to stop haymakers. We're trying to stop the One Ring. We're trying to stop an Escaped Flage, Goblin Bombardment. Anything past those, we probably don't kill. Oh. Rewind. Let's go to our turn and stop. Okay, I had to tank for a minute on this because all I could think was there's got to be some way I can have a really good turn here. And it turns out that really good turn is lethal. Maybe you can spot it, but if you can't, I'll give you a little hint here. So if you want to pause the video and see if you can find the guaranteed lethal, the hint is Graveyard Glutton. That's your clue. If you don't want to pause, I'll continue on. So Graveyard Glutton has the ability that when it attacks, you can exile up to 2 cards from a graveyard. And for each creature you exile, your opponent loses a life, you gain a life. So ETB exiles something, attacks, exile something. If it's daytime, you exile 1 thing. If it's nighttime, you exile 2. It's currently nighttime. So Graveyard Glutton could let me like Bowmaster down their Amped Raptor, attack, exile the Skyclave Apparition and an Amped Raptor, deal 2, so they're down to 15. And then I've got Psychic Frog discarding Force, Spell Pierce, Nihil, Spellbomb, so it's up to a 4. I can exile Force, Spell Pierce from the yard to give it flying, get the FrogTide up to a 10. Well, that's 14. That's not 15, which the Graveyard Glutton would get me down to. What I can do is discard my entire hand to Psychic Frog, all 4, get the frog up to a 5/6, exile the Force and the 2 Spell Pierces to give the frog flying. So the FrogTide goes up to a 10, the frog goes up to a 5, is 15, and then attack with the frog, the FrogTide, and the Graveyard Glutton, and exile the frog and the Bowmasters out of my own yard, deal 2 to my opponent, and kill them exactly from 17. So we hop the frog, put our counters on the FrogTide, frog gets up to a 5, attack with the Graveyard Glutton and the frog and the FrogTide, exile 2 creatures out of our yard. Exactly lethal. Love to see it. Now, I believe this is on to round number 4. No, this is game 3 of round number 3. Yeah. Game 3. Got caught up in the FrogTide kill. It's also why Murktide, in my mind, has an edge over Oculus. Not playing out the Psychic Frog on 2 because my opponent had mana available. Run the risk of them just having like end of turn burn spell. I have to discard and untap burn spell or something. Untap Static Prison, and I fall behind pretty heavy. I'm guessing this was a misplay on them, just clicking Static Prison, but I will not turn down a free dodge of a removal spell like that. Could also be just trying to get cards in the yard for like Flage. Decided to take the Spell Pierce as an answer to the One Ring. Because I don't know if you're aware, but that card's kind of nutty. Wanted to see what I drew before I decided on Counterspell or not. Since I drew the Spell Snare, ended up deciding to throw it off or fire it off. But, okay. Yeah, because I drew the Spell Snare, decided to fire off the Spell Snare instead of the Counterspell. If I hadn't have drawn a Spell Snare, I'm probably letting it resolve and Fatal Pushing the Ajani and just leaving the token behind. But I can't guarantee that. Actually, I can. That's what I would do. My opponent does end up having a Flage. They go for a Lightning Bolt on the Trespasser, just ditch the Flage. I decided to just let the Lightning Bolt go. I could Spell Pierce it, but my concern here is still the One Ring. If they've got a One Ring, I lose the game on the spot. If they don't have a One Ring, I get to go to my turn and play a Frog and a Counterspell, and that's like a pretty good follow-up. So I don't need the Graveyard Glutton or the Graveyard Trespasser to get me across the finish line. But stopping something like a One Ring here would. Guide of Souls is fine. Go ahead and knock that off. Got the discharge, so we want to keep our Frog alive. Start hopping in. I should have just discarded this basic Swamp to the Frog and try to get a little extra damage. That's something I try to be better about. Doesn't always work out, but yeah, like I do here, but I should have one turn sooner. Saw Stern Scolding, something else. Throw them back because if they don't answer the Flage and they don't answer the One Ring, I don't care about it. Like, I'm not countering an Amped Raptor. Then this is just deck knowledge, like understanding that my opponent can't get back the Flage this turn. They don't have another Elegant Parlor in their deck, more than likely. So, like, Fetch Land doesn't do anything. The only thing I care about is a ring. That Spell Pierce could answer a ring at that point. So now we're on to match number 4. No lands, mold of 6. We do get to keep some cantrips, so a little bit better. Underground Mortuary, expecting like Yawgmoth. I need lands. Not Yawgmoth. Okay, so probably Goryo's Vengeance, right? Do find a land. We're able to Fatal Push the Frog. They ditch the Atraxa. Tough. So if I had known that it was Goryo's based off the turn 1 Underground Mortuary, I would have just held up Spell Snare instead of going for the Preordain. But since I thought it was Yawgmoth, I needed to find lands to get closer to Murktide. And I wanted to do it while they didn't have a turn 1 Mana Dork. But again, that's the joy you take with a very hedged pre-board game plan. Also, we're never beating Teferi in a million years, so Teferi obviously can solo us with a handful of counter spells. You add in the fact that they can Philology Archaeologist back a Goryo's Vengeance with an Atraxa in the yard and double duty. So easy scoop up there. Go into game 2. Trimming on some cantrips. Trimming on some of the spot removal. Bringing in the Grave Hate like Graveyard Trespasser. Bringing in Nihil Spell Bombs. Bringing in bolts. Something else that I brought in. Oh well, maybe we'll see it. Just a lot of trimming in this matchup for the most part. Oh, the extra Thoughtseize brought in. So we get to catch them a little lacking here with a really bad hand of a bunch of lands, a Tainted Indulgence, and an Ephemerate. So get that Tainted Indulgence out of here. We get to free roll the Frog. Hopefully they haven't found interaction. I would not consider Nihil Spellbomb necessarily to be interaction. And then now that we found Force Negation, we can just like Windmill Slam the Trespasser. We've got Force in case they do find like a Teferi off the top. So feel pretty set at this point. Of course, depending on the frogs, I want to keep the cards rolling in. Fetch up an Undercity before combat. Technically, all right. Technically, in these situations with Undercity and Frog attacking, you should probably wait until the Frog connects, and then with the draw trigger on the stack, fetch up an Undercity Sewers. The reason for that is if I fetch up with the Undercity Sewers, assuming that I'm going to draw the card, and my opponent ends up having like a Solitude is their unknown card, and they can Solitude away the Psychic Frog, then I kind of mess up that entire sequence by thinking I'm going to have the card in hand when I won't. But if you wait for the Psychic Frog draw trigger to go on the stack and then fetch up the Undercity Sewers, then you can know for sure that you're going to draw the card or not. All right, another Force Negation should kind of wrap things up pretty quickly. Here's the Teferi. Get that out of here, especially with basic Swamp. We know that they're not going to be counterspelling back. Or the Swamp, or discard the island. Make sure this is a 2-turn clock. Nihil Spellbomb, and on to game number 3. All right. I think this is like a really good hand against them, but you have to make sure you're sequencing correctly. So having Thoughtseize, having Frog, with the basics is fine. I know Counterspell's a little awkward with basic Swamp, but we've got a few draws to maybe find another blue source. But you've got to make sure that you, like I said, are sequencing correctly. This is a deck that's not going to be doing anything impactful on turn 1, but has a lot of good plays on turn 2. So like Philology Archaeologist, Tainted Indulgence, Psychic Frog, all those. What they all have in common is they're all blue spells. And at least 2 of them are creatures with power or toughness 2 or less. So I could lead on Thoughtseize here, but I run the risk of my opponent having 2 copies of something they can do, like a Frog and an Archaeologist. And I take one of them, they get to resolve the other. Now my counter spells are kind of useless. But if you lead on the island and hold up Stern Scolding or Mystical Dispute, then if my opponent leads on like an Archaeologist, I can Stern Scolding, untap, play my Swamp, Thoughtseize, take the second one, and still have Mystical Dispute up for something like Teferi. So if they do nothing, that's fine. I still get to go to my turn, still get to Thoughtseize, still get to Mystical Dispute or whatever. Going for the Watery Grave here instead of the basic Swamp because of Counterspell. If I go for the swamp, and I know I'm not counters. All right. Mana consideration. If I go for the swamp and I draw, like I counter something on their turn, then next turn, no matter what I draw, I can't counter spell plus another blue spell because I'll have the basic swamp down. If I go for the Watery Grave this turn to Thoughtseize and counterspell something, Mystical Dispute, whatever, go to my turn next turn. If I find another land, another blue source, then I can counterspell plus another counter. And it gets me closer to like Murktide plus counterspell. So the damage really doesn't matter against this deck. So I'm not afraid taking a few extra points here. Let's rewind to that Thoughtseize. Okay. So double Philology Archaeologist. Could have been in their opening hand. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. But it kind of solidifies that idea of not Thoughtseizing on turn one. Because I could have been staring down like Emperor of Bones Archaeologist or Double Archaeologist or something like that. And it would have looked really bad in the face of that turn one Thoughtseize. But now I get to like clear out a creature here, or clear out, in this case, the Goryo's Vengeance, because I can't counter it. I get to interact with this Archaeologist. I get to go to my next turn, maybe play out a Frog, maybe hold up a counter spell, who knows. Spell Snare being like the S tier draw I could have right here because it allows me to interact with Prismatic Ending. So, yeah, I absolutely recognize that these draws are lining up fairly well. Spell Snare, the pending. Now, Thoughtseize again, just jamming in with Frog and Murktide. Take away the Emperor. If they find a land for Teferi, cool. If they don't find a land for Teferi, cool. Opponent scoops it up. So, yeah, like, I do think there's a correlation with playing tight and getting paid off for it. So we played tight in those early turns. We got rewarded with some good draws, but we put ourselves in a position for those good draws to be rewarding. Like, we didn't give up the tempo advantage in the early turns, and was able to take advantage of that by finding more counter spells that looked really good into a hand where they couldn't cast stuff because we didn't give them an opening to resolve stuff early. Yeah. This is match 4 on the, or match 5 on the play. I've got a Consider on turn 1, Fatal Push. Opponent revealed Giganta, so we're assuming energy. We'll find a second land right off the bat, which is nice. Take a hit from this Ocelot Pride. Trying to like Spell Snare in a Johnny or an Amped Raptor or something, and then Fatal Push the Pride. They do have follow-up Ragavan, which is annoying that you have to interact with the Pride's second main phase if you don't want them to make a token. I could have just let them have a 1/1, but when you're sitting here with a handful of counter spells, it can become an issue to like let anything resolve that creates extra bodies. So I was really happy at this lineup here. Like, we forced ditching the Frog because if I've got this Murktide down, I'm not playing out a threat that opens me up to like Lightning Bolt, Galvanic Discharge being an issue. So decided to play out the Frog, find the fetch land to be able to get down the Murktide, get Undercity, so I just flip whatever's off the top of my library. Hopefully it's a spell to grow the Murktide. It wasn't. But I do just have like lethal and 2 attacks here. So tack them down to 10. Go to their turn. And I do want to talk about this line a lot. Okay. So my opponent's attacking with the Ragavan into my 5/5 Murktide. I don't want to say obvious play, but the big consideration is if I block this Ragavan and they flage, then they take out my Murktide Regent. They add the Ragavan to the yard, Flage to the yard. They already have the Arena of Glory on the battlefield. So if they just follow it up with like Escape Flage next turn, I could just be dead. I don't outgain the life that they gain from Flage. They would gain 3 off the Flage ETB, killing the Murktide. Put them to 13. I'd hit them for 8 down to 5. Next turn, they'd escape Flage. 3 to me. They'd gain up to 8. Attack with Flage. They gain up to 11. That's more than my Murktide's dealing. So they're out racing me there. The other consideration is if I block, I open myself up to like Murktide getting lightning bolted or galvanic discharged. And then again, there's a chance that the race changes. Like if they have kill off my small Murktide and then static prison the big one, I lose all my pressure. So all the signs are pointing towards letting the Ragavan hit me. My deck is mostly like counter spells. They can't fatal push my Murktide. They can't play out a Frog or a Murktide of their own because they won't have double blue or blue-black. So, like, can't sink into Stupor Murktide. Like, 95% of the hits are completely dead. It's basically a cantrip is a decent hit. Or the one of Shoot the Sheriff. The one singular Shoot the Sheriff in the deck. One. Hit it, take out the big Murktide. I got a 2-turn clock with the little Murktide if everything goes according to plan. They didn't have a follow-up Flage, so maybe there's a chance. But let's be real. If you played against Energy once, you've played against Energy a million times, and you know that they will top deck the Static Prison. And we'll top deck the land. And we'll top deck the... Oh, nothing this turn. I know it's coming up. I've been through this, literally. So, you're sitting here thinking like, okay, well, you just wait out the Static Prison, you get your Murktide back. Now, I don't want to restart. Amped Raptor off the top. To an Ocelot Pride, pretty good. So they get another energy to keep the Static Prison around another turn. Plus, put a hasty 2/1 on the board and a 1/1 that goes wide. Top deck a land. Not the most exciting thing in the world, but you know. At least they're down to no energy, so we can get our Murktide back. Don't want him going wide here, because it's going to take me multiple turns to kill him. Another Amped Raptor, which flipped into, I think, a ring. So they couldn't cast it, but they get 2 more energy to keep stuff around. Okay. So I saw Fatal Push Frog on top. The reason that I decided to keep the Fatal Push, I kept both of them on top, but drew the Fatal Push. And it's because of the difference in amount of turns it gains me. if I play out the frog and they have an answer to the frog, then they hit me for 4, down to 4. I draw the fatal push, push one of the raptors. They hit me for 2, and then untap, hit me for 2 again. So it's a 3-turn clock. If I draw the fatal push first, push one of the raptors now, and then they have an answer to the frog next turn, it's a 4-turn clock. So I get an extra turn for not like playing the frog out right away. Obviously, there is the chance that I could play out the frog and they don't have an answer to it, and I get to get a couple attacks in, or just get one attack in, which probably could be the right answer. Like, either I give them an extra draw to find a removal spell if they don't have it, or I give them an extra draw. What am I trying to say? Either I give them an extra draw to find the removal spell, or I give them an extra draw to find something more impactful. Trying to remember what my decision was on the... Oh, my block here was purely because of Lightning Bolt. It feels like a card that they could have here, and if I don't block, I'm just dead to Raptor, hit, sack, bolt me. So I decided to make them have like the discharge. Turns out they did have the discharge. So there's probably a couple points there at the end of this game that I should have just like made them have it at different points. Like, kept the frog on top, made them have the removal spell for the frog right then and there, and just be willing to ditch my whole hand to save the frog. And then I could have made them like have the bolt and not care about the discharge, and didn't do that. Well, I guess I did make them have a removal spell. It was just the not one I wanted to see. So Johnny, make a token, kill us, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I think it's probably better to make them have the answer sooner rather than give them the extra draw step. So probably should have just taken the frog the first time, played it out, made them have an answer to the frog, and if they don't, ditch my entire hand the next turn and fly over for lethal. So game number 2. I already talked about sideboarding versus Boros. I feel like it's a matchup we've discussed sideboarding fairly extensively against, so I don't want to go too in-depth there. Getting the Polluted Delta so I can go ahead and get my basic island. I could also have up Counterspell, but more than likely I'm just fatal pushing this Ragavan. Like I said, just play around Blood Moon a little bit. Out my frog. I've got Spell Pierce for like an end of turn discharge or bolt or something. A Johnny. So if they had attacked him with the Ocelot there, I would block and let them flip the Ajani, because I could just fly over the cat and kill it on the crackback. This was... I thought about playing the Murktide, and then ultimately decided I didn't want to like not keep up Counterspell or Spell Pierce in the face of a One Ring here. So I would rather draw the card if I'm not going to play the Murktide. And if I'm not going to play the Murktide, then I might as well make the Murktide into Frog Fuel and start like clocking in the air. Got Spell Pierce up for the 1 ring. If they want to go for a, what's it called? A Flage, kill off the frog, I'd discard Pierce and a counter spell. But it looks like they're just going to try to go wide with some tokens, which isn't the worst idea in the world. But we're going to go wide with frogs. And it's going to block and flip a Johnny. Finding Bowmaster is really nice, but as soon as I decide on that attack, knowing that they can block, my entire game plan just becomes keep any sort of black permanent off the board. Just make it so that this Johnny 0 isn't dealing damage, and then I can start discarding pretty heavily and like attack into the frog or attack into the Johnny. Not feel too bad. So we're just going to suicide everything into the Johnny here. If they block one of the frogs, we can discard it, eat the cat. Any way they block, we're going to kill the Johnny, which is the important part here. Like, as long as that Johnny is no longer on the board, I'm kind of fine. Flage is fine because it's just going to kill the army token. They can't kill one of the frogs while I can discard. So all I got to do is be ready to counterspell Flage on the way back. Which should be reasonable now that I have double frogs attacking. Got Fatal Push for the cat. We've got double counterspell for anything off the top. I'm not gonna. I think I play the FrogTide because the only things I care about here are Flage or 1 ring. Like any removal spell like that on the FrogTide, I'm not countering. I'm not fighting over that. I don't want to give my opponent a chance to resolve something impactful. And then, yeah, opponent scoops. But from here, I'm just never tapping off double counterspell and throwing anything extra into the frogs. So this is match 3 of game 5, playing for the trophy. I would love an opening hand with a piece of interaction, like a removal spell. Take the extra force because I can't Fatal Push on their turn, but I want access to the Fatal Push down the road. Get pretty paid off with that Goblin Bombardment there. Spell Bomb down in case they want to Flage. So Amped Raptor flips over into an exercise to take out my Nihil Spell Bomb, which I would love to have a chance to draw off of that, but at the end of the day, just take the opportunity, nuke the yard a little bit. I could play out the Trespasser here, but I'm more concerned about the 1 ring, so I'm going to hold up Force Negation instead. If they play a Flage and get it to the yard, I can always Trespasser afterwards. If they don't do anything, I can Undercity Sewers. And this should be Undercity looking for a blue card for Force, because I want to be able to Trespasser next turn, exile the Flage, and then hold up Fatal Push, or hold up Force Negation. Push the Raptor. We do get rewarded with them having the 1 ring, so we get to exile that, untap, have our Graveyard Trespasser. Unfortunately, we don't have an answer for another ring if they happen to have one, but we at least have a clock going. An Ocelot Pride's a good spot for us. Upkeep discharge, ditching another discharge. So Graveyard Trespasser kind of doing its job there. We did get to Exile a Flage. We got 2 cards out of hand. Perfectly reasonable for 3 mana. The Pride. Now we're kind of in a top deck stalemate, but Murktide's a pretty good way to break out of a top deck stalemate. Yep, Static Prison. Turn Scolding a Raptor. So we could have sat on this Murktide to try to find a counter spell, but it's definitely a little bit of a toss-up. If I had another Undercity Sewers, I'd probably sit on it for a turn. But because I didn't, I run the risk of something happening just like what's happening now, where I don't see the counter spell. And if I don't see the counter spell, then my opponent could have just been dead in the time it took me to find one. So if I wasn't going to see it anyway, I'd rather have the Murktide out and not see it than, you know, there the Murktide in my hand and not see it. So at least I make them have the Static Prison exercise. But doesn't always work out the way you want it to. Opponent does get their Giganta down. Get our Murktide back, but unfortunately our 3/3 Murktide, not the most imposing figure in the face of a 5/5 Giganta. So we need to find another frog. We need to find, we still have, no, we used Shoot the Sheriff on that Ocelot Pride. So Sink into Stupor is the only way I have of dealing with the Giganta. Orcish Bowmaster can provide a chump block for a couple turns. So give us a chance of finding a frog. I think, I'm not sure if I should have Fatal Pushed the Sun Cleanser there. Part of my reasoning was I wanted to save the Fatal Push for something more impactful, but I did shut myself off of exactly that. The Toxic Deluge is an out to the Giganta. Attack, because they got protection. Shooting the Giganta, so if they decide to attack in, I can block with the army token. Guide Bombardment, pretty good. Arena, really good, because if they find a Flage, I'm just like uber dead to that. So this is what I'm talking about. We've had the discussion a few times on stream and like in the Discord and such, where I've made the argument that I don't think Bowmasters is that good against Boros. And we'll have people all the time that are like, I don't know, Bowmasters is phenomenal against Boros. It's so good. It's good against the One Ring. It's good against some of the creatures. And you have situations like this come up where I've got a Bowmaster, my opponent's got a One Ring, and they just don't care about the Bowmaster. They're just going to keep using the One Ring because I just can't put enough pressure on their life total with the Bowmaster for it to matter. So they end up having like another Johnny and just get to kill me with Bowmaster or Bombardment sack triggers. But yeah, like the decks that play the One Ring have enough answers to Bowmaster where it's not just running away with the game. So I just don't think it's something that you need to be like all in on. Oh, I've got to have Bowmaster against Boros, or I've got to have Bowmaster against the One Ring. There's just a really good chance that they don't care about it or they have enough ways of dealing with it, because we're late enough into the Bowmaster ring meta where everybody knows these cards exist. They know what are good against them. They know how to counteract what's good against them. So keep that in mind. But as far as the deck goes, I did enjoy the premise of playing these extra cantrips. I think that it helped find like FrogTide or helped find land drops a little bit more than normal. Having a little less interaction, or like not having a second shoot the sheriff, not having a second sink into stupor, definitely felt. Tameo, I liked. Obviously, I like Tameo anyway, but getting to watch her actually win a couple games with the ultimate or threatening the ultimate was very, very cool. I will say in the legacy leagues that I've played, I've done a lot more buying back spells with Tameo, but I think that has to do with the fact that in legacy, once she flips, there's very few ways that are played to deal with her, and there aren't really aggressive creatures pressuring her. But in modern, once she flips, it's a lot more likely that your opponent's going to be swinging in with something, and you might not have the ability to buy something back. So that is a consideration if you're lower on the Tameo train than I am. Otherwise, yeah, still going to be looking for some ways here and there of kind of adapting this deck a little bit closer to its legacy counterpart. See if I can find a configuration that really works for me. But if you have suggestions, would love to hear them down below. Other than that, I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.